Hello, everyone. My name is Carol Wright, and I am the founder and editor-in-chief of NYOTA magazine. NYOTA is a quarterly online publication that features emerging stars in music, fashion, and culture. And I'm here with a new series on the channel and a new video, which is exciting, and it's called How It Was Made. Basically, just going to be doing a deep dive into how the latest issue of NYOTA was created, and that is issue 36, our June issue. We're an independent publication, and I thought it could be just a fun experience to kind of go through the process of finding features, having to decide, what should the magazine focus on, and how do you even reach out to people to get things going, all of that and more. And so I want to make a video about it and kind of just show what happens and what we do to put this whole thing together. I think with larger magazines, even I'm curious, obviously, as a reader, to see how does that happen? But obviously, you can't always get those details. Things are very buttoned up and secret, and so I thought it'd be really fun to kind of discuss it all. Basically, I'm just going to break this up into parts, with part one being really the beginning, and just starting with how do you decide who's featured, and then how do you contact people or reach out to people to get those people featured. And so NYOTA itself, of course, has this overarching focus of featuring people who are up and coming, people who don't have large platforms, people who might be popular, but they haven't really hit that huge threshold where the whole world might know them, or people are filling out stadiums to see them, different things like that. And so I always try to kind of find the balance between like finding the up and comers and people who are really about to break through and become huge kind of stadium stars, if they're musicians or blockbuster movie actors, all of those things. And so the first thing it really starts with is figuring out the theme of the issue and then who fits within that theme. And so every single issue of NYOTA does have a theme, and we actually have a media kit, which kind of breaks down what the theme of each issue is. And I use that when I send it out to publicists and managers and people who we want to feature. And so the theme for June always is Art is Life. And basically, Art is Life just means we want to focus on how important art is in the world and how it's kind of shaped the people that we featured. So obviously, if you're a musician, if you're an actor, if you're an actual like artist in terms of painting or photography, different things like that, art is clearly your life, or it's a very central part of your life. And even as consumers, people who like to go to the movies, like to go to live music, like to paint in their free time, like to take photos of their friends and make little scrapbooks, like to go to ceramic shops and, different things like that. Art is an important part of your life. And I really think art kind of has become an important part of everyone's lives when you really think about it. And so we really wanted an issue that focused in on that and touched on that. And so when it came to June, I had to kind of figure out, okay, who we want to feature also has to tie into this Art is Life theme. And I have to figure out, like, how does that all work together? So after I have the media kit, of course, telling me, okay, this is the theme of our issue this time, I kind of go through and I try to figure out who can I contact and reach out to and who do I want to feature. And so it's a bit of a, I guess, two-way street, I would call it. So on the one hand, because the publication has been around for 8 years, almost 9 years now, we do have relationships with publicists, with managers who send us and pitch us talent that they think we should feature. They're like, oh, I have so-and-so singer, they have this album coming out, or oh, I have so-and-so actor, they have this movie or this TV show that's going to come out. Do you think they'd be a fit? And so I always have to go through a lot of emails to kind of figure out, okay, who makes sense? Should we feature them now? Should we do a website interview instead? Should we figure out like a pivot, or can they be a cover star versus just a feature in the issue, figure out kind of how we want them and how we want to promote them. And then there's also just the side that I do, which is research. It is true research, but a lot of it takes place on social media. So I like to say research because it's also when I'm on my downtime scrolling, even then I could be using that to find people who might be good fits to feature in the magazine. A lot of people nowadays that I find on TikTok and also on Instagram, but mainly TikTok because there's so many up and coming musicians that like to post their music. People who do like sketch comedy on there that I think could be really cool, different things like that. So I kind of take both of those paths, the pitches and the research on my end, and start to kind of figure out, okay, from here, who am I reaching out to? So if it's somebody who already sent a pitch, then of course I'm just replying and saying, oh, thank you for reaching out. I think your talent, or, I obviously have their name in the email, but I think they have an amazing song. Thanks for sending it to me. I'd love to feature them. We actually have our next issue coming out on this date or in this month, and I think they could be a great fit for that issue. And that's kind of how that ball starts rolling. And then when it comes to me finding people, of course, that's more cold emailing. So what I do is I put together an email that discusses like who I am, what NYOTA is, the issue we're working on, and the theme and the kind of points this theme is going to cover. And that I think this person would be a great person to feature. And I also attach our media kit, because the media kit itself doesn't just get into details of the themes for the issues, but also gets into the details of NYOTA, how it was made and why, what we do each quarter, and our social media following, as well as our readership and like numbers and the number of reads we've gotten across issues, as well as the number of impressions we've gotten across issues. So people can see that we've had impact. People are actually going and seeing what we produce. And so there are benefits to your talent being featured, or if I'm reaching out to someone one-on-one, to them being featured. And that's really the path and kind of how I start to get people who are interested and who want to be featured in the magazine. And along with that, I think it's really just kind of a waiting game of, if I'm reaching out to people cold emailing, then I have to see, okay, let's see if they reply. And if they don't, then figure out the right number of follow-ups or timed follow-up, versus being like, okay, maybe it's not going to happen this issue. I'll try to circle back at a later date if they fit another issue. Versus if it's a pitch and I've emailed them and they email me back and say, let's do it, then just figuring out a timeline for me sending through the interview questions, or having to set up a phone interview and actually getting something done, over video call or just over normal call, and making sure that that can work with the talent schedule, because obviously these people are very busy. And so it's just kind of figuring out that part of it too, which is an interesting part for the features, and really figure out my own timing with when can we get that done and have it done in a timely manner, so that my graphic artist doesn't have to worry too much about last minute interviews coming in. And so, yeah, it's kind of all these different moving parts. And that's really part one for me, is kind of figure out that talent portion. And then once you kind of start to narrow down who's featured in which section of the magazine, you can it helps me build an outline. So speaking of the outline and the components of an issue, so I like to use Google, just their entire system, Google Drive, Google Docs, all of it. It really helps with organizing, especially because the team is really small for NYOTA. It's just me and my art director, Nicole Cox, who does all of the graphic design for every single quarterly issue by herself. She's a one-woman team. She's incredible. And so it's really just us working together and collaborating on this. And so honestly, keeping things in an outline really comes in clutch. So what I do is I create an outline of the issue. I break it down to segments: music, fashion, and culture. And then I start to put in, okay, who's featured in the music section, who's featured in the culture section, who's featured in the fashion section. And essentially, I try to find a balanced number. There's always more culture features than anything, and fashion usually has about 2 to 3. I try to find that balance really, and try to make sure it's at least 4 in each, at least for music and culture. And I also always have a playlist in every issue that we have Sophie Satcher, who always contributes and curates our playlist for every issue, that can also be found on Spotify, just a little shameless plug, for every single issue. And she makes those. And so that's always the top of our music section. And then depending on the timing and kind of what I'm looking at, I try to find maybe collaborators who might want to write an article for the issue, or submit artwork, just depending on what this issue is. And so it really depends on timing, who I've reached out to, who I've heard back from, and all of that, and the organization kind of process there. Then essentially on the outline, I also try to do a timeline. So I always like to put, okay, we want to publish on this date, Friday, X date, so that I know and my graphic designer knows, okay, this is when we want this to get out in the world, which also helps us just our own personal sort of duties that we have to do. And so that's really that process there. And then once I start to kind of build out, okay, who's featured in which section, I start to plan it out. I know then, okay, I have to create these interview questions or schedule these phone interviews so that these things can be done quickly. And so a lot of it is really just research again on my end in terms of the interviews. I like to go through people's social media, their websites. I go through and read a bunch of old interviews they've done. I like to watch things on YouTube if they've done any kind of on video, audio interviews. And I like to just see, reviews of their albums, if they're a musician, of course. If it's a movie, I like to see reviews for movies. I like to look up the co-stars, like the full cast of a show or a movie, so I can see, okay, who have they worked with, who have they learned from, what was the interaction there. And then if it's not that cut and dry in terms of musicians and actors, if it's an entrepreneur or maybe someone who's, a photographer, painter, sculptor, I'm saying the wrong word, but sculptor, all of those things. And I just kind of do the same process, except depending on obviously how prominent this person is in terms of reach and fan base, there might not be too much out there. And so I honestly have to like fill in a lot of gaps through my own research, trying to find out as much as I can about these people before I send the interview questions to them or before I say them to them over the phone. And really, I just like to do that because I find, and I think a lot of people probably find this as well, is that a lot of interviews can be very repetitive, especially when someone's on a press tour. I'll say specifically for actors, and you will read their interviews, and you're like, how have they gotten asked this question 4 times in 4 separate interviews? And it's kind of like, what's going on? Is there a disconnect? But obviously, when they do press junkets, they're rapid fire. You got to keep it moving. They're not long form, or maybe they are, but they're still just like getting asked the same old for sound bites. And I completely understand it, but it's really important to me to try my best. Of course, maybe it doesn't always happen, but to really ask questions that people might not already have been asked, or at least try to reframe and get to new information. And so that's why that kind of research process really makes sense to me and for what, we create here at NYOTA. And basically, once I kind of start that process, then, okay, we've got interview questions sent out. We've got phone interviews scheduled or completed, which is perfect. And just for, I guess, little tidbits, I'm trying to think of different things that are in this process that I might not be thinking of. Even if it's a phone interview, you've just sat there and talked over the phone. So I just have a recording. I then have to take that recording and get it transcribed. And I also have to not only transcribe it, but of course, edit and break it down to have it flow more naturally, because we then put it in more of like a Q&A typed out format in the magazine. And so when someone's just talking free form, sometimes I ask extra questions to keep the conversation going, or I try to fit in different things or have personal anecdotes because you are having this conversation that I can't then put in the magazine because it'd just be too long and too confusing to read, honestly. And so then it's kind of going through and parsing through, figuring out like what's the best thing to add in or edit out. So there's a lot of that too, which is kind of something small that people might not realize. Of course, people always have to do, but it's just those little things while you're making the publication. And for issue 36 in particular, I did have a couple phone interviews, which were extremely enjoyable. I interviewed Saint Lundy, who is a musician, and also Tim Scott, and actually like had such a good time talking to them. They were really cool. But it's even those things you have to then think about once you're done with those phone interviews and how to kind of break all that information down into a digestible format. So those are just some of the things kind of in that part 2 research, interview, organizational process that kind of happened behind the scenes.